Hello everyone, welcome back for another look at American history. We're continuing with period 2 of the APUSH curriculum today, and we're looking at British colonial diversity in the age of empires. So, what we're really looking at is the time period when those other empires that we've covered before, so Spain, France, Portugal to some extent, are still existing, but because the original United States eventually forms out of what were British colonies, we need to focus more on what was going on specifically within the British colonies at the time. So we're narrowing our focus into just the British colonies. And here we go. So the way this presentation works is it breaks down each slide into different regions of the British colonies that would eventually become the 13 colonies and eventually the United States of America. So first of all, the Chesapeake region. So the Chesapeake is this region right over here. It's this bay that comes in from the Atlantic Ocean, and it includes the states that are today Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia. So oftentimes this area is called Delmarva. So Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, VA. Okay, so please know this term that they're called the Chesapeake Colonies or the Chesapeake Region. Eventually we'll start to call this the Upper South, but the Chesapeake is a good geographical sort of landmark that you need to know to designate this area. All right, last presentation we talked a little bit about Jamestown, founded in 1607. The Virginia Company was the joint stock company that founded this. They got a charter from the British government to start an economic enterprise over there. So they had goals to be there more permanently, but at the same time, they were there to make a profit. They weren't there to start sort of a new life with families and all that. It was taking young men over there in order to grow tobacco, reap it, bring it back, make a profit off this new thing that was getting many people addicted to it back in Europe, which we can see all the way till today. Now, this was not an easy lifestyle. Imagine going somewhere. One way that I often think about it is think of us thinking of exploration to Mars or into space. Going to somewhere where the terrain is completely unfamiliar, you don't have maps for what's going on at all. So when they arrive, the struggle was just to survive. They didn't know the land, they didn't know what to plant there to actually eat and survive. So we see huge death rates within the first few years. It takes about 15-20 years for Jamestown to stabilize as many more Europeans come across the Atlantic to settle there, replenishing the dying population. Just so you know, eventually Jamestown and then Virginia gets established as a royal colony, moving on from a charter colony. The difference is a royal colony has more British administration from Great Britain. A joint stock company, a charter colony, basically says, here's this contract, here's how you're going to do things, you do you. A royal colony is more saying that there's purview, there's a lot of regulation from the British government, and this is going to happen with Anglicans. So Anglicans is is the term for the Church of England, so followers of that branch of Protestantism. So that means that Catholics can't go there, people of other religious denominations can't go there, it's only for Anglicans. Now, in response to this, as the British actually look at more religious diversity and some of their issues kind of warring between Catholics and Protestants in England starts to go away, there's this push for having a Catholic colony in the same way that Virginia was created as an Anglican royal colony. And that's what we get in Maryland in 1632. So, similar to Virginia, but for Catholics. So that meant that people were still going there to grow tobacco. It's the same region, it's the same climate. And it was founded by a guy named Lord Baltimore. So if you know one of the major cities within Maryland is Baltimore, it's named after him. He was a Catholic aristocrat within Britain who was saying, hey, if you're gonna have it open to Anglicans, you need to open up colonization to Catholics as well. So that meant that Maryland operated similarly, but it didn't have an Anglican church structure within the colony. It had a Catholic church structure. Alright, and what we're going to move on from here now is different types of colonies. The ones that develop after this are called the Restoration colonies. Okay, now the Restoration refers to the restoration of the monarchy under Charles II. So if you go back to British history and the English Civil War, the people, Parliament, decide to execute Charles I for abusing his power, gets replaced with a short-lived republic under the Cromwells, and soon people see, you know what, this didn't solve any of our problems. We still have a tyrannical leader, so they get rid of them too and bring back Charles I's son, Charles II. Alright, so that's what we're talking about with Restoration. So the type of colonies that happened under the Restoration are what we call proprietorship. That means that they're royal colonies, but the ability to establish those colonies was limited to one person directing it. Kind of if you think about like establishing a governor of the colony in a way, someone proposes it, puts together everything they're going to do, appeals to the crown. If the crown grants it, then they become the proprietor. So same thing as kind of like the owner in a way of this colony. Now the one thing is it had to operate within English laws, but most of these people looking to form colonies were proud to be British in the first place, so they weren't looking to change those. Some proprietorship colonies, the Carolinas, so actually Caroline is the adjective for describing the era of Charles I and Charles II. Okay, so as we are deep in the South here, still kind of in that Chesapeake region, there's a strict racial hierarchy in order to reinforce the slave system. So remember chattel slavery. In order to make sure that the social system was working, they put in this hierarchy to put African slaves and any free blacks at the very bottom of the structure. What they were growing is rice and tobacco. Years on from now, there's going to shift production to cotton. We're nowhere near close to that right now. Cotton was difficult to grow and not an effective way to use your land back then. Alright, so remember, all these colonies are in the Chesapeake region, and the climate and the soil was very fertile and good for growing cash crops like tobacco. Okay, it's hot, it's humid. That is what is needed for growing tobacco. As you get further south, you're going to grow more rice, and even further south, you're going to grow sugar as well, which requires really the wettest, hottest climate possible. And remember, cash crops are in high demand back in Europe. Labor trends that we see happening within these colonies, there's the movement from Indian labor, which didn't work out because there was lots of conflict between the colonists in Virginia and the Chesapeake and the local natives. The movement towards indentured servants, which I talked about last time, eventually kind of dies out as a result of a smaller supply of people willing to sign these contracts. They were just able to pay their way themselves, and eventually becomes much cheaper to go the African slavery route. Now, the other reason that slavery worked out in this way is because what I'm calling, and I'll call it again, the color line. This idea of even if someone who's a slave tries to escape, they're still black. They're still marked as the other in a way, so someone different from the powers in society. So it was easy to tell them apart from people who were free. All right, so on to part B here. So what we're focusing on is moving a little bit north up to the New England colonies. So Chesapeake's colonies were the first to develop. New England colonies are the second to develop, as I mentioned before, with the Puritans in 1620. So this is very mythicized in our culture with the Pilgrims and Thanksgiving and all that business. Just so you know, New England is this region that's in the picture right there. Today, those states that are in New England: Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Vermont, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Maine. Okay? Religion and government were fused with each other, which was one of the problems with the Puritans of the way Britain was. They didn't think that the government was pure enough, and they were looking to almost form this utopia by going all the way to the other side of the world to get away from what they felt was kind of a corrupt and immoral government that didn't have enough religion. And the way this looked for them was only male church leaders were allowed, and only they could vote. So in a way, there's like a little bit of democracy, but not much at all, because you had to be a leader, so powerful, and you had to be involved in the church. Remember, in this case, church and government paired together. Now, something that's different about New England from the Chesapeake colonies is there was a gender balance. So in Virginia, it was mostly young men looking to strike it rich. The goal of New England was to create sort of a new land, this utopia. So lots of families went over. It was easier to repopulate because there were men and women and families in order to do that. So these communities stabilized, I would say, more quickly than Jamestown did. There were early struggles, and that's where kind of our myth of Thanksgiving comes from. You know, the Indians, the natives, and the Pilgrims, the Puritans, coming together to share this meal. Okay, it's pretty much a myth. But after those struggles and eventual conflicts with the natives, where the Puritans want to convert the natives, and when the natives say, "We're good," they didn't like that, because remember, the Puritans were looking for toleration of their religion, but not looking to tolerate other people's religions. What they do eventually form, you can call a Yeoman Society. Yeoman means a small farmer. That means that they had small tracts of land where they grew crops, raised livestock, and used what they had and sold a little bit of the extra off to buy things that they could not make themselves. Another way to define New England is a freehold society. Freehold means that people own their land freely. Okay, so there's not like feudalism where there's a lord who owns the land and you work it. The person who works the land is also the person who owns the land. So as a result, New England mostly has farm families. Okay, social structure here, women were viewed as subordinate to men. The women's jobs were within the house in the private realm, and they had a lot of children. When it was dealing with the public realm, like government, like trade, that was the man's area. So these very traditional outlook on gender relations. So if you can imagine women having 6 to 7 children average, that means 50% of women were having more than 7 children. This was for a few different reasons. One was that the infant mortality rate was much higher back then, so lots of children didn't survive infancy, so they kept having children because some of them would die off. The other reason was, maybe you guys experienced this at home with your parents giving you chores, but child labor in a way. So they needed people to work the farm that were in the family. Once children, could walk and talk and do all those things, they were then put to work on the farm. Education was not a goal at this time. The goal was agricultural production. They grew corn, so crops, livestock. It was small-scale farming, so it was not cash crops. The soil was not good for growing cash crops there. The soil itself is actually much rockier and doesn't have all the nutrients that further south in the Chesapeake area that it does. And also in New England, the climate tends to get colder more quickly, so that's not going to be good for growing tobacco. All right, the way land worked for the European colonists in New England was it was inherited by children and divided evenly. So what that means is if you're having 6 to 7 children each, you're dividing your land into 6, 7 pieces. We're going to run into a problem later on where there's no longer enough land to go around as the population grows, and that's going to cause this push into native land, causing more conflict and eventually the American Revolution, as a matter of fact. Right? Women's land went to their husband once they were married. Okay, so keep in mind that there was this gender imbalance. Shouldn't be a surprise. All right, next up are the middle colonies. And if you want to think about what colonies count the middle ones, they're the ones in between New England and the Chesapeake. So that's going to include New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware sometimes counts as Chesapeake, sometimes counts as middle colonies. It's kind of like this borderline one. Okay, so there you are. So one of the first middle colonies was Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is going to be a major power player as we move forward with colonial history and into the American Revolution. And the proprietor, so the person given the ability to form this royal colony, was William Penn. So you can see Pennsylvania. Sylvania is Latin for the forest or the woods. So it really means Penn's woods. Okay. Okay. He was a Quaker. So that's a different branch of Protestantism. Basically, Quakers were known for being pacifists, for objecting morally and religiously to war. Something he did differently is he actually paid the natives for their land. So rather going in and saying, "This is ours," before taking it, he offered to pay them for them to leave. It's going to change later on, but at first that was his idea. And within Pennsylvania, he was looking for religious toleration. So What that means is he was not looking to form an Anglican colony or a Catholic colony. He was looking to form a colony where there was room for any denomination of Christianity or other religions as well. So there weren't many other religions. Most of the colonists were Christian, but there was room for toleration here. Also, women had a little bit more rights. We're not talking about the right to vote. We're not talking about a modern sense of civil rights, but back then they had more rights than they would have had in other colonies. Right. The other major middle colony was New York. So this used to be a Dutch colony that was started with Manhattan by Peter Minuit years and years ago, where he supposedly bought, Manhattan for $20. It's a complete myth. I can talk about it in class if you want. So the reason that New York really flourishes is because New York City develops as a port city with the Hudson River there that has access to the interior. So that meant that they could trade with natives. That meant that they could trade with resources that were available further inland, and then use the port of New York in order to get out to the Atlantic to take things back to Europe. All right, so let's talk about Pennsylvania a bit more and how demographic changes happen. So remember, William Penn's encouraging diverse immigration, so in terms of religion, but also in terms of nationality. So most colonies were just English, but he was saying, we'll take Germans, we'll take Dutch, we'll take whoever. But as these new immigrants come over, they often became what are called squatters. So squatters means that you go out, find land, you see it's not being used, so you occupy it. Now, you don't own the land, you don't have any legal right to the land, but you're living there and working it, and eventually some colonies create things called squatter rights, which means that if you've been there long enough with nobody noticing, then you can't be kicked off right away. Okay, if the landowner shows up and says, hey, you've been working my land for 10 years, how dare you? The person would say, well, I have squatter rights, I've been here long enough, I've been using the land productively, which you have not. So they couldn't get rid of them right away. So populations that come over are Germans and people from Scotland and Ireland. Actually, it's interesting that if you think of the German populations, in Pennsylvania today, there's Amish communities. The Amish actually are descended from German immigrants from all the way back then, looking kind of like the Puritans to form their own religious utopia away from the world where they were facing persecution themselves. Okay, so it becomes the most diverse colony as a result of religious toleration and openness to non-English immigration. But as that happens, the Quakers who founded the colony become a minority, which means that they can't enforce good Indian relations anymore. Remember, they said, we're going to pay for the land, we're going to build a good relationship. That diminishes as these squatters come in and just start taking native land left and right without paying for it. So as this shifts, Penn shifts his policy as well, and eventually he takes a lot of native land near Philadelphia for his own family, and Philadelphia is going to grow to be one of the most important cities in colonial America, especially when we get into the American Revolution. Okay, of course, so if you've seen Quaker Oats before, there's William Penn, he's on the front. That should be a good image to help you remember that. All right. Next one is about colonies in the South, and what we're kind of lumping together here are colonies that are on the southern Atlantic coast and colonies that are all the way down in the British West Indies, so in the Caribbean. They had a more similar climate, they grow similar things, so we're just kind of lumping them together. Okay, southern Atlantic colonies, so South Carolina, Georgia. Just so you know, Florida is still Spanish at this point. So, ideal climate for growing cash crops. Similar to the Chesapeake region, but even hotter and more humid. So tobacco is similar to the Chesapeake region, but they also grow sugar, rice, and indigo because the colony is hotter. Okay, now notice, as these areas get further away from the locus, kind of that central closest point to colonial power up in northern ports, they're viewed as kind of less desirable areas to go. So that's why they develop later, because it's further away from the power structure. But what happened is wealthy people, or people who are looking to establish themselves as wealthy and can't get land in the Chesapeake, go down into South Carolina and down into Georgia to get lots of land to create a plantation aristocracy. So getting lots of land, having large plantations with many slaves, looking to grow their wealth and their own power, and as they do so, they develop what becomes the southern United States, leading all the way up to the Civil War in the 1860s. Further south down in the British West Indies, so in the Caribbean Sea, a couple of the British-controlled islands there are Barbados and Jamaica, so still part of the British Commonwealth today. So as you get closer to the equator and the tropics, that means there's a longer growing season, so you can continually grow, especially sugar, more often. Speaking of sugar, it was very profitable because the climate was so bad, or so severe in terms of heat and humidity. But here's the thing about sugar cultivation as well. It was one of the most severe processes. So tobacco was already, not great for cultivating. Sugar was even worse. So this is one of the first stops for the slave trade, and where a great majority of the slaves from the African slave trade would go, because there was such a because there was such a large death rate among the slaves. Because it sounds horrible, but they just didn't last longer. Because the conditions and the work was so much more difficult than what they would find on the east coast of what would become the United States later on. So that means there's few to no small-scale farmers. These islands are occupied by a large percentage of slaves with few landowners. This is going to cause problems later on when our revolution begins, the Haitian Revolution begins, and there's this fear that the slaves are going to hear, like, hey, wait, we have natural rights too? Well, we're 80% of the population, why don't we just overthrow the masters? All right, so that's why such strict racial hierarchy existed from those in power. They wanted to make sure that slave rebellions would not happen. Okay, Southernmost colonies were the first stop in what we call mercantilism, or the triangle trade, or the South Atlantic system, and that's what you see on this map right over here. It makes a sort of triangle shape, and with different things brought at each point along the way. I'm going to talk about it in more detail in one of the next slideshows. Okay, so first stop to drop off most of the slaves. Some were still then brought up into North America. Alright, there we go. This is our last slide, and this isn't really talking about any one region in particular, but what it's talking about is what was developing within these colonies as Britain wasn't paying much attention to them. Okay, that's what's meant by lax attention, is that Britain kind of said, if these colonies can run themselves and we don't have to interfere, that's awesome, right? We're going to make a profit through this system of trading with them and them serving us, and we don't have to pay a lot in order to run it if they want to run the show themselves. Britain liked it a lot. But what happens in that void is in New England and in the Chesapeake and the South as well, there starts to be this sense of political autonomy. So running the show themselves and feeling like they had the right to make decisions without British input. Okay, one way this happened is colonial assemblies. And the way these worked is white property-owning males could vote. Notice that's an expansion from what New England was at first. New England at first was members of the church. Now it's property-owning males, and if you have New England where it was a Freehold Society, there was a lot more voting because a lot more people owned land. Okay, still, elite families tended to dominate the legislatures, especially in the South, like the House of Burgesses, which fewer people were involved because fewer people owned land. In New England, many people owned small bits of land. In the South, few people owned large amounts of land. Now, eventually, when the people want to rebel or they're mad at Britain for various acts to try to control them, the colonial assemblies will be used in order to get the people together and convince them that what Britain is doing is wrong. We're the ones that are supposed to be making decisions on your behalf. So, we the people, so to speak. All right, a term that you absolutely have to know is called salutary neglect. Okay, and that's what's meant by lax attention in the description to the left. Salutary means good. So, in most languages there's some form of salute, which is like a toast, or it's a greeting saying like, hello, salutations. We even have that in English. So salutary means a good thing. Neglect means that it's being ignored. So what we're looking at is many colonists viewed Britain's lax attention is actually a good thing because they got to run the show themselves. One of the reasons that this came about was the Glorious Revolution. So this was an event back in Great Britain wherein Rather than overthrowing their king like they did with Charles I by executing him, Parliament went to the king and said, we have decided we no longer have confidence in your ability to run the show, so we're asking you to leave, and we've decided we want different people to be our monarchs. And guess what happened? No blood was shed. The king went away, these new monarchs came in, and that's why it was glorious, because really no blood was shed in the process to cause a change in government. So that's different from the English Civil War, correct? Now what happens is these new monarchs that come in, they don't want to mess with the system, right? Because they don't want to, get kicked out as well. So they're very careful about how they administer their empire, and they make this thing called mercantilism work. Mercantilism is the idea that the colonies should be serving only the motherland. So they should only be trading with them, and mercantilism was being profitable, so they didn't want to mess with it. But as mercantilism continued, it also developed an American identity. People got used to not having the British there to control them, having that sense of autonomy to control themselves, and so some of the colonial elite said, hey, if we can do this ourselves, why do we need the British? And how did they do this? Smuggling. Okay, it was socially acceptable. When we get to the American Revolution, John Hancock himself was so rich because he was a smuggler. Smuggling would happen by not trading with exclusively the British, so trading with the French, trading with the Spanish, even though they weren't supposed to. Okay, so that's their response, and since there's not much British intrusion at the time, they could get away with it. So, now, Salutary Neglect was good for Britain, it was good for the colonies, but eventually works against the British over time, because when Britain comes back in and tries to assert control, being the disciplinarian, the authoritarian, the colonists say, no, we've proven we can do this ourselves, we no longer accept your authority as legitimate. So, the example I love to give with this is, think about teachers. Let's say a teacher basically doesn't care about how you use cell phones in the classroom. They're on the desk, whatever. He doesn't care. What's going to happen with that if that teacher then tries to enforce some school or district policy that you can't have cell phones out at all? Guess what? You're going to say, that's a BS policy. You have already told us and shown us that you don't care, so why are we going to think that this is a legitimate rule for you to have? There's going to be chaos. There's going to be rebellion. Okay? Now that's what happens with the British about much more serious things like how you trade and what your livelihood is. Okay? People care about those things a lot more. Alright? Southern gentry, so gentry means kind of like the aristocracy, develops under the system of local autonomy. I mentioned the House of Burgesses before. Those are the colonial assemblies that exist down in Virginia and Maryland. Okay? So as time goes on, these colonists have this feeling that British control wasn't necessary. They can do it themselves, and the elite have built themselves up that they're really running the show. So it's not really to say that the people are running the show, but the people are choosing representatives who run the show for them and represent them more. Okay? So, leaders, courts, taxes, they're all locally chosen and operated. When Britain comes in during the American Revolution and starts to change who the leaders are, what courts try you for crimes, and who is creating the taxes, it's going to cause major problems because salutary neglect had existed for about 100 years before that. We're talking several generations who were used to this system, which is now just completely thrown out. Alright, thank you for watching as always, and there are your same next steps. So please do those things to stay on track. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.